Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Welcome. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. The strike at Canada Post is impacting many in our country, including our First Nations communities, which are not receiving medicine. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre stood up in the House of Commons, demanding the Trudeau government curb its inflationary spending. And a special political forum will be held in Lethbridge tonight, involving the candidates who are vying for the Lethbridge West seat for the December 18th by-election.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. As negotiations continue between Canada Post and its union, the strike is hitting many Canadians pretty hard. The Assembly of First Nations says the work stoppage is delaying supplies of medicine and other necessities from reaching rural and remote communities here in Canada. It is calling for an immediate resolution to the impasse, which is now nearing the 4-week mark. The union, CUPW, is seeking wage increases and more job protections, but Canada Post says the union's latest proposals widen the gap between the two sides. As Canadians await the federal government's fall economic update next Monday, federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre stood up in question period, demanding the Trudeau government stop the inflationary spending, which he says is driving many more Canadians to the poorhouse.
After doubling the debt with inflationary spending, doubling the cost of housing with more bureaucracy that blocks building, doubling the number of people using food banks with carbon taxes on farmers and truckers who bring us our food. Finally, they're planning a fall update, but they'll do it in the snow on December 16th. Our message is stop. Yes. Stop the inflationary spending. Stop the tax increases on food and homes. Stop indebting Canadians. Will they please just stop?
On the 16th of December, we will present our economic record in this chamber, and we will talk about the fall economic statement. And I anticipate that you're going to hear a lot about the economic record that we've amassed. One thing that I anticipate you'll hear about is what we've done with respect to childcare. On childcare, an economic affordability model, we've brought it down to $10 a day in 8 provinces. That has resulted in 110,000 women joining the workplace. What is that record, Mr. Speaker? 85% of women are now participating in the workforce in Canada. That is a record high. That is what we stand behind on this side of the House.
An NDP motion to permanently pause the GST was defeated in Parliament. Leader Jagmeet Singh says the Liberal government's 2-month GST pause, beginning on December 14th, should be completely axed to help cover monthly expenses such as internet and phone bills. He also says the other federal parties voted against expanding the government's proposed $250 rebate checks to include more than those who are currently working.
In addition, they also voted against a senior getting that check. They voted against people living with disabilities getting that check. They voted against a single mom taking care of her kids that had to make sacrifices, not getting a check. That's what they voted for. They voted for them not getting a check. I think it's clear that Canadians need someone who's going to fight for them, who's going to fight for tax cuts for the working class, not for billionaires. That's why I'm running for Prime Minister.
Economic freedom is something that Canada really prides itself on. Now, according to a recent study, however, some provinces enjoy more of that freedom than others. Matthew Mitchell is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute and co-author of the study, Economic Freedom of North America 2024. He shares how Canadian provinces ranked compared to the rest of North America.
Alberta is one of the freest states actually in North America. It comes in at 12th place, tied with Tennessee, South Dakota, Colorado, and Texas. These are states that are generally known for relatively free market policies, and Alberta is right there with them. Well, the rest of Canada did not do nearly as well. So the next highest Canadian province is British Columbia, and that's way down at 43rd in all of the U.S., Mexican, and Canadian provinces and states. So unfortunately, the Atlantic provinces tend to be the least economically free in Canada, and they tend to be relatively unfree relative to the United States and the rest of North America. Now they enjoy significantly greater levels of economic freedom compared to the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, for example, or compared to all the Mexican states.
Make sure you catch the entire interview with Matthew Mitchell with the Fraser Institute and BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up later in our broadcast. You know, there's a push by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation to have the CBC completely defunded. Chris Sims is the Alberta director of the CTF, and she brought forth her concerns in Ottawa at a recent Heritage Committee meeting earlier this month. She joins us now from Lethbridge to discuss this in more detail. Chris, why are you echoing Pierre Poilievre's talking point on having our public broadcaster defunded?
I must say, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation started this, and we think Pierre's copying us. But we're happy to have any political party pick up this torch and say that the CBC needs to be defunded for three major reasons. One, the CBC is costing way too much money. This year, it's $1.4 billion. To put the money into perspective, that could otherwise pay the salaries of about 7,000 police officers and 7,000 paramedics. Two, nearly nobody is watching it, Hal. The CBC gets microscopic TV ratings. And three, journalists should not be paid by the government. It's a conflict of interest, and it's got to stop.
Now, Chris, many people would argue that nothing can be done about defunding the CBC until we see a change in government. How do you see it?
It's one of those things, right? Prime Minister Justin Trudeau really needs something to give him a boost in the polls. And so far, it sounds like he doesn't want to scrap the carbon tax. And he continuously doubles down on things like seizing people's private property in the forms of firearms. And we're seeing now, from the looks of it, a terribly bigger deficit than even we had feared. So, hey, maybe this is something that he can pick up on. But based on his recent comments in Halifax, where he sniffed at that idea of defunding the CBC, so much so that he really doesn't like bumper stickers, really makes him mad, I don't see him making this change. However, Pierre Poilievre has committed to defunding the CBC, and we will hold him to that promise if he forms government.
Now, some believe that if the Conservatives do get in, they will only defund CBC English TV and not the French side, since it would give TVA a monopoly over Canada. How do you see this playing out?
We don't want them to do a half measure. We want the line item, that is the CBC in the federal government budget, deleted. So in this case, if it were the most recent budget, $1.4 billion gone. I will point out the CBC/Radio Canada does generate around $500 million of its own money, apart from government. So that's nothing to sneeze at. That money could be used for things like Radio Canada or a form of Radio 1. It could look a lot like TV Ontario. Combine that with a bunch of subscriptions and donations and support. They could do their own thing free from government, and that's what they should do.
Thanks so much for your time today, Chris. That was Chris Sims, Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, joining us from here in Lethbridge. Canadian government officials say they will evaluate asylum claims of people who have fled Syria following the Assad regime's fall. Immigration Minister Mark Miller says our asylum system is not seeing the same pressure as European counterparts such as Germany and Austria. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad fled the country over the weekend and is reportedly in Russia after opposition forces seized the capital, Damascus. Soon after the news broke, Ottawa urged Canadians to avoid all travel to Syria and to consider leaving the country if it's safe to do so.
I think some countries face asylum seeking levels from Syria in much higher quantities than we do. With Germany as an example, Greece is another. We don't face that flow in Canada. I don't know what rank they occupy in terms of source countries for asylum seekers, but it's pretty low down there. Our inventory is a little less than about 2,000, so it isn't something in terms of volume that we're facing. The Immigration Refugee Board assesses and reassesses on a constant basis the reasons for people to claim asylum, so that's something that we'll, I think, monitor carefully.
Well, it was another fairly mild day today in Lethbridge as we hovered right around the freezing mark. Jeanette Rocher is in now with a quick peek at the forecast. Jeanette, considering we're close to the middle of December, the weather really hasn't been that bad.
Yeah, not bad at all. It's kind of nice to not have to contend with the snow these days, but I don't want to speak too soon because I know there are more flurries coming, possibly as early as this weekend. But for now, we're looking at a little bit of a slight temperature drop there for Wednesday. Wednesday's temperature hovering around -1 with a 15-kilometer-per-hour wind. Not too bad, but enough to have some wind chill factor. So keep that in mind, especially in the morning. We're looking at wind chill factors of around -12 and then -6 for wind chill by the afternoon. But you know what? After that, on Thursday, we're going to be heading back into the pluses, and I'll be back later in the show to tell you all those details.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeanette. Charges have been laid and drugs and firearms were confiscated following a number of busts in Lethbridge, Raymond, and Colehurst. Alert says 4 firearms were seized along with thousands of rounds of ammunition, body armor, cocaine, other drugs, and around $1,500 in cash. Even though homes were searched back on November the 21st, police just released the details earlier today. 52-year-old Randolph Langdale, 37-year-old Daoud Mohammed, 36-year-old Jebediah Caswell, and 24-year-old Kira Davarin face a number of drugs and weapons-related charges. Candidates who are competing for the Lethbridge West riding will be answering questions from the media and public tonight at the main branch of the Lethbridge Public Library. The 3 who are vying for Shannon Phillips' old seat are the UCP's John Middleton Hope, the NDP's Rob Miyashiro, and the Alberta Party's Leighton Vaverka. Now, Jonathan Jarvie is one of the coordinators for the event and explains what time the forum will begin, how the format will look for tonight's event, and how the Alberta Party candidate Leighton Vaverka was invited, but due to a work commitment is unable to attend.
Leighton was invited. Unfortunately, he has a work commitment that he's unable to get out of. So he won't be able to attend, but there is going to be somebody from the Alberta Party that comes just at the beginning to offer a statement from Leighton. So that'll be one of the first things that we do during the evening. The election forum starts at 6 o'clock p.m. in the theater gallery at the main branch of the public library. So we're going to have candidates from both the UCP and NDP to come take questions from the audience, as well as a media panel that have some pre-set up questions. And if people have a chance to ask about any issues that are important to them, whether it be healthcare and the lack of doctors in Lethbridge, education, or anything on their mind.
I've been fortunate enough to sit on past media panels. I'll also be there tonight on behalf of BCN during the political forum and look forward to seeing you there. Now, the folks from Elections Alberta say advance voting is now open for the Lethbridge West riding. Lethbridge City Council discussed on Tuesday solutions to the deficit placed on the Lethbridge and District exhibition. Chief Financial Officer Daryl Matthews recommended a continuation of operations of the LDE as the costs of shuttering operations remain equal at $4.1 million per year for 3 years. He presented several payment options, including using additional tax increases, full or partial use of the budget contingency, and a reduction of city services to cover the costs. Matthew concluded that there are no low-risk options for both the city and taxpayers. He says all options available would require an increase in taxes or a reduction in services. As of the time of air, no decision has been finalized yet by City Council. Lethbridge Mayor Blaine Higgin presented a key to the city to a local doctor. Cardiologist Dr. Saya Zilke was bestowed the honor on Tuesday afternoon at City Council. City officials say Zilke received the recognition thanks to her tireless efforts to improve and advance cardiac care here in southern Alberta. They say she also helped to spearhead a new cath lab for Lethbridge. Government officials say the planning is complete, and now the project is on to the next phase to determine the scope, schedule, and budget for the new lab. The key to the city is a municipal government's highest honor and is given to recognize the outstanding civic contributions of each recipient. You know, there's still time to purchase some toys for the Angel Tree. The campaign is down to its last 800 children to purchase and donate unwrapped gifts for. There are certain age groups, however, that Angel Tree is running low on. Michelle Gallucci of Lethbridge Family Services said they're missing toys for 12 to 24-month-olds, along with more girl items.
We're missing dolls. We have no dolls, 0 dolls. So if you want to give something, dolls is the thing. Baby dolls or older dolls for 6 to 9-year-olds and LOL dolls or Monster High dolls. We need dolls. So this year we are assisting 4,267 children more than last year. So the need is great. And it's because it is our economy affecting now the middle class. So now the middle class have found that the cost is higher for them. The donations are down a little bit. We are very lucky. Our donations dollar-wise are, we're coming into it, but we're still down 25,000. I expected a lot worse. The toys, however, are about half. So we're hoping that maybe we'll see a push towards the end. We've had to spend a lot of money on this campaign. And we do it because we're not leaving a child without toys. And every child gets the same amount of gift bundles, new toys, and new socks, toques, gloves.
Now, if you plan to donate an unwrapped toy or monetary donation, you can drop it off in person at Lethbridge Family Services until December the 20th. Another group that's pretty busy collecting and distributing donations right now is the Southern Alberta Bikers. Toys and money collected through their toy run this fall have gone to Senator Buchanan's school, the Angel Tree campaign, plus Child Life Services at the Chinook Regional Hospital, along with both food banks and the student food banks at both post-secondary institutions here in the city. And they're not done yet, according to Dallas Hardy, who's the president of the Southern Alberta Bikers.
Well, we've still got some money coming in this year, and I believe by Christmas time in total will be probably between $6,000 and $7,000 that between what the checks that we presented last weekend and some donations we'll be making between now and Christmas. If anybody wants to make a donation, and that's the thing that everybody needs to know is our club, 100% of what we get goes back into the community. The club keeps nothing. We like giving back to the community. We like putting smiles on people's faces. It's kind of a feel-good thing.
Hardy says the Southern Alberta Bikers donate throughout the year and not just at Christmas time. A local charity and home of Bridge City News, the Miracle Channel Association, is in the middle of its Christmas fundraising campaign called Experience His Presence. The Lethbridge-based nonprofit held a live broadcast event last week and is set to bring part 2 tonight, right after BCN at 6 o'clock Mountain Time. Miracle Channel's Vice President Jeff Thiessen joins us now from Winnipeg with more of the details. Jeff, you say the organization is setting some pretty big goals for 2025.
Yeah, thanks, Hal. It's just great to be with you tonight. My goodness, I can't believe what Miracle Channel is all doing. You're part of it. If you're watching Bridge City News, you're getting to enjoy some of the great things we do here. But tonight, the telethon is going to be outstanding. Jeremy and the team have just been getting prepped for this night, and it's just going to be a wonderful opportunity for you to find out what's going on at Miracle Channel Association. Lots of good things. We're going to be making more announcements over the next week or two of God doing amazing things. But this is a homegrown charity right here in Alberta. And it's just an awesome thing to see what God's doing. Make sure you tune in and find out.
Now, you have a pretty ambitious goal of doubling the donor base, Jeff. As a Canadian and Alberta charity, how's the Canada Post strike really impacted your holiday fundraising campaign?
Thanks, El. Yeah, exactly. Canada Post is really doing a number on charities right across this country. Miracle Channel is no exception. We really need help and support this time of year, and you can make a difference by either going online or making a phone call. If you join us with a telethon, you're going to love it because there's so much, not just great content, not just great announcements, what God's doing, but an opportunity to see what, the difference in people's lives Miracle Channel is making. So make sure you call tonight.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff. Experience His Presence, a Miracle Channel Christmas fundraiser, will begin right after a supper hour newscast tonight. Well, it was mainly cloudy today in Lethbridge, but not too cool, and we'll have more of the weather details for you coming up shortly. Jeanette Rocher is now with a full look at our weather picture here. Jeanette, some of my neighbors have been enjoying their outdoor hot tubs during the evening because the weather really hasn't been that bad here in Lethbridge.
I know, it's been so lovely, and I don't blame them at all. Maybe just give them a heads up, though, that it's going to get a little bit chillier tonight. Not horrible, kind of what you would expect for this time of year. Overnight low of -7. You're going to feel the wind chill, though, factor, especially in the morning. Going to feel like -12. But climbing to -1 tomorrow, and then we're going to climb even higher, back to 0 on Thursday, and then we're going to see some pluses. At least one day of plus there for 4 degrees on Friday, 0 on a Saturday, and then there's those flurries I was telling you about earlier. We could see 40% chance on Sunday, and then a mix of sun and cloud on Monday. Both Sunday and Monday looking at a high of -8. So about to get a little bit chillier, so we're going to have to enjoy those 0s and -1s and 4 degrees while we have them. Average high for this time of year, 0. Average low, -12. 17 was the record high on this day, and that happened back in 1908. And in 1919, we had the record low, which was a freezing -39. Sun rose this morning at 8:18, and the sun set this afternoon at 4:31. We're actually seeing 1 minute less daylight than we did yesterday, so 8 hours, 13 minutes to be exact. On the west coast tomorrow, Victoria sitting at 7 degrees with a mix of sun and cloud. Vancouver, high of 8 degrees, could see some 40K winds in the Juan to Fuca Strait. 60% chance of flurries tomorrow in Edmonton with a high of -5. 0 for the high tomorrow in Calgary. As we get to the rest of the prairies, we're seeing more wind chill factors closer to the -30s, where it's going to give us some risk of frostbite there for all three of these cities. -20 the high tomorrow in Saskatoon, -24 that is. The expected high tomorrow in Regina and Winnipeg coming in at -20 tomorrow. So the prairies are very frigid. And then the rest of Canada out east is very wet. Okay, so Toronto seeing that mix of rain and snow. Could see a 40% chance of showers, 60% chance of flurries. 5 for the high 4 degrees in Ottawa. Well, Ottawa under a rainfall warning tonight through tomorrow evening. So could see 10 to 15 millimeters of rain this evening, another 5 to 10 tomorrow. Same thing for Montreal. Actually, it's flipped for Montreal. 5 to 10 tonight and 10 to 15 millimeters of rain tomorrow with that high of 5 degrees. Now, Fredericton is seeing a rainfall warning and a freezing rain warning, a high of 11 degrees, looking at 5 to 10 millimeters of rain. Same thing for Halifax. 10 degrees for the high there. Charlottetown coming in at 10 degrees tomorrow with 5 millimeters of rain expected tomorrow, and periods of rain expected tomorrow in St. John's with a high of 6. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
Kevin O'Leary, in partnership with the Municipal District of Greenwood in northwestern Alberta, plan to open a $70 billion AI research centre known as Wonder Valley. O'Leary, who is known as the host of the TV series Dragon's Den and Shark Tank, claims it would be the largest real estate project ever proposed in Canada and the world's largest AI data centre. The planned site would cover 7,000 acres, 40 kilometres south of the city of Grand Prairie. O'Leary, in a statement, says it's the perfect site, crediting the cold weather climate, highly skilled labour force, Alberta's pro-business policies, and attractive tax regime. O'Leary says he expects the future site to offer 7.5 gigawatts of low-cost power to hyperscalers over the next 5 to 10 years. Wonder Valley is expected to be developed in multiple phases and bring an influx of job opportunities to Alberta. Some First Nations groups in our province are looking for an impact assessment review of a Pathways project here in Alberta. The Pathways Alliance group of oil sands companies is proposing to build a carbon capture and storage network worth $16.5 billion. 8 First Nations groups say the unprecedented and massive project poses potential risks to both the environment and human health. While Pathways has started submitting applications to the Alberta Energy Regulator for approval, the groups say there should also be a federal review instead due to the project's potential impact on reserve land and Indigenous territory. The Chief Financial Officer of Flair Airlines is facing involuntary manslaughter charges. It's in connection with a single vehicle crash involving an underage driver who'd been drinking at his home near Atlanta. The district attorney for DeKalb County in Georgia says a grand jury indicted Samantha Rao, his wife, and the teen driver of the SUV. The Georgia couple, who prosecutors say were known to host underage drinking parties, allowed an 18-year-old to drink at their home before allowing her to get behind the wheel and drive. The 3 survived the crash, but an 18-year-old female passenger sadly did not. The 18-year-old driver of the vehicle, Hannah Hackemeyer, faces a number of charges, including vehicular homicide. Now, here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was down 121 basis points to 25,504. The Dow was down 154 points to 44,247. The S&P 500 was down 17 points to 6,034, and the Nasdaq was down 49 points to 19,687. West Texas Intermediate oil was up 14 cents to 68.51 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 1 cent to 3.19 US. Gold was up 34.47 to 26.9393 US an ounce, and silver was up 7 cents to 31.90 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.43 per bushel, barley is at $6.66, canola is at $14.10, and corn is at $7.87 per bushel. Live cattle were up $2.05 to $189.85. Feeder cattle January contract was up $1.53 to $257.33, and lean hogs were up 50 cents to 78.25. And the Canadian dollar was slightly down over the past 24 hours and currently sits at 70.50 US.
Recapping one of our top stories, as negotiations continue between Canada Post and its union, the strike is hitting many Canadians quite hard. The Assembly of First Nations says the work stoppage is delaying supplies of medicine and other necessities from reaching rural and remote communities here in Canada. It is calling for an immediate resolution to the impasse, which is now nearing the 4-week mark. The union, CUPW, is seeking wage increases and more job protections, but Canada Post says the union's latest proposals widen the gap between the two sides. Is there such a thing as economic freedom here in North America? Matthew Mitchell, a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute, co-authored a study on the subject and offered his thoughts in an interview with BCN's Jeanette Rocher. That Q&A is coming up shortly. When you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. Also visit our website anytime to check out a number of stories and interviews.
How free are we, economically speaking, in Canada, and how free are we in our individual provinces in comparison to the rest of North America? Well, today's guest is going to tell us exactly how well we're doing. Matthew Mitchell is a senior fellow in the Center for Economic Freedom with the Fraser Institute, and he's the co-author of the study Economic Freedom of North America 2024. Matthew, welcome. Great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Perfect. Okay, so first, how are we defining economic freedom? What does that actually mean, and practically speaking as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the idea of economic freedom is basically, are people allowed to make their own economic decisions? And you can think of it really as a spectrum. In some places, you're allowed to make more of your economic decisions about buying and selling and entering markets and competing and running your business. And in other places, you're allowed to make fewer of your own economic decisions.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So how did you go about doing the rankings? What kind of criteria are being used to compare this?
Yeah, so we're looking at several policies. It's all really focused on state and provincial policy. And then also we're trying to incorporate some differences between the different countries in terms of how they affect policy. So primarily we're looking at factors like spending, taxing, regulation. In order to compare between the countries, we also look at the degree to which the governments are permitting people to buy and sell across borders through barriers to international trade, monetary policy. We're also looking at how well persons and their property are protected. Are the police enforcing property rights? Are they making it easy for people to enter contracts and enforce those contracts, or do they stand in the way of that?
Okay, so I'm in Alberta, and Alberta once again finished at the top of the Canadian rankings, and Alberta also had a huge jump in its overall ranking. So last year it was a 41st place, I think, and now at 12th. So that's a huge jump. So do we know what some of the reasons were that spurred that upswing?
So a lot of it is actually, unfortunately, it has less to do with changes in Alberta policy and more to do with changes in other provinces and states that have shifted it. So Alberta is one of the freest states actually in North America. It comes in at 12th place, tied with Tennessee, South Dakota, Colorado, and Texas. These are states that are generally known for relatively free market policies, and Alberta is right there with them.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So how did the other Canadian provinces rank?
Well, the rest of Canada did not do nearly as well. So the next highest Canadian province is British Columbia, and that's way down at 43rd in all of the U.S., Mexican, and Canadian provinces and states. So it's tied with Massachusetts, Minnesota, and New Mexico, actually.
Okay, interesting. New Mexico, of course, where you are right now. What about out east, the Atlantic provinces? How were they doing? I understand they're kind of lagging pretty far behind.
Yeah, that's true. So unfortunately, the Atlantic provinces tend to be the least economically free in Canada, and they tend to be relatively unfree relative to the United States and the rest of North America. Now they enjoy significantly greater levels of economic freedom compared to the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, for example, or compared to all the Mexican states. And that does account for their higher degree of prosperity. So one of the things we find is that places that have more freedom tend to enjoy higher levels of prosperity measured by income or growth, less poverty, things like that.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Which states, out of curiosity, were the top rankings?
So New Hampshire has enjoyed the top spot for the last several years. They're among the freest places really in the world. Other relatively free states are Oklahoma, South Carolina, Florida, Indiana. All of these are relatively free places.
Okay, so what is it that they are doing better that we can maybe learn from?
Yeah, so number one, they keep the footprint of government relatively small and modest. Government is doing its job in terms of protecting persons and their property from theft, and that's wonderful. But they're managing to keep their taxes low and keep their spending low, and then they have relatively high levels of labor freedom. So it's easy to start a business and run a business in those places.
Okay, it's interesting that the total income in the freest jurisdictions grew 29% over the last decade. So while the least free jurisdictions, total income fell 13%.
Yeah, so what this is if you're looking at all of the income that people make in these places, and after you adjust for inflation, yeah, it's really remarkable. People tend to flock to economically free places. So one of the things that we find is that employment increases higher, much more faster in economically free places, as well as the number of people there, and then they start earning more income. So yeah, even after adjusting for inflation, if you look over a 10-year period, the freest states and provinces in North America, incomes grew 21 times faster relative to the least free.
That is, and I think there was something in there that said over the same period, the population of the freest states grew, was it 10 times faster?
Yeah, that's right. So we have a measure that both looks at, we look at the population as well as the total employment growth. So population grew 10 times faster and total employment grew 3 times faster in the most free relative to the least free.
Okay, that's interesting. So what would you say to those who may argue that the difference in economic freedom may be correlation, but that it's not causation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, of course, correlation and causation is economists are sort of obsessed over these types of questions, and so it's possible. It is always possible that maybe it just happens to be that the wealthiest places in the world or in the states tend to have higher levels of economic freedom. However, what we can do is we can look at both case studies where places go from relatively unfree to free. You can see this both in an international comparison. You look at a place like Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania that were some of the least free places in the world and are now one of the freest, and they change. That extra degree of economic freedom seems to correlate positively with growth. Same thing, you can look at case studies. So, you look at a place like North and South Korea, or you look at, my state, New Mexico, and compare it to surrounding states. And you start to see not only is there this correlation, but when you dig into the specific examples, change seems to lead to greater prosperity. And then there's more sophisticated techniques where economists try to tease out causal inference through sophisticated things like instrumental variables. But one of the things that's really pretty interesting about this research is just how large it is. So to date there have been literally 1,000 studies assessing the effect of economic freedom on human prosperity. And so what I tend to say, to students or to anybody who's reading any research is, don't trust any one study, but trust a literature. Once you start to see that there's tons and tons of data piling up from lots of different studies using lots of different techniques, and it's all generally pointing in the same direction, that makes you start to think, well, gee, maybe economic freedom really is causing some of this prosperity.
Yeah, no, that's wild. And I think you mentioned this earlier, the top ranked provinces and states, they also have a much smaller rate of poverty. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. There's new research actually coming out from George Mason University's Vincent Galoso and others that he's Canadian originally, that finds that poverty negatively correlates with economic freedom at the provincial level in Canada, and this is consistent with what we find with international studies as well.
Does the overall higher economy impact the poorest of the poor in a positive way, though?
Yes, absolutely. So, one of the things that we find is not only are average incomes higher in states and countries that have higher levels of economic freedom, but the income of the bottom 10% is also significantly higher. So, and in fact, actually, the ratio is greater. So it seems to be that economic freedom is good for, say, the median citizen, but it's really good for those who are least well off among us.
It's also notable that the average economic freedom across all those 93 jurisdictions has fallen every year since, 2017? And it's now just slightly above its all-time low.
That's right. And so one of the things that we find, if you kind of look at a broader perspective internationally, is some of those places that have long enjoyed prosperity, and I would argue largely because of economic freedom, there's sort of some complacency that goes on. And so in those places like North America, the United States and Canada are unquestionably some of the freest places in the world. And yet there are also places where we just see this kind of long-run stagnancy in terms of economic freedom. And there's a lot of places on the world, on the other hand, where you're seeing significant increases in economic freedom. I mentioned, parts of Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe.
Now, I'm curious, do the top ranked provinces or states have tax rates in the higher end of the rankings, or is it pretty much consistent that lower tax rates end up matching with economic freedom?
Yeah, I mean, there's some variation, of course, and different provinces and places rely on different taxes in different ways. So, for example, I mentioned New Hampshire is one of the most economically free states. Generally has low taxes. It does actually have a relatively high property tax burden, however. But across the provinces and across the states, in general, if you tend to have lower taxes, you're going to score better on economic freedom, and then that tends to correlate with better economic outcomes.
Is New Hampshire coming out #1 in the world or just in North America?
In this study, we're not comparing the jurisdictions, the subnational jurisdictions, to places outside of North America, so it's hard to say. But you start with the United States is, I think it's #5 in terms of the world, and now you have New Hampshire within the United States as one of the freest places there. So you can kind of guess that it's one of the freest places.
So what's coming out #1 in the world, or the top 3?
So right now, the economically freest jurisdiction in the world is Hong Kong, and they have been in that position for a very long time. However, if you're studying some of the recent developments in that territory, that the government is cracking down actually on some civil and political freedoms, which has made it plummet in terms of overall freedom. And that is having a negative effect on some of the economic freedoms enjoyed by Hong Kongers as well. Singapore is also quite high on the list. Interestingly enough, a lot of the Scandinavian countries score quite well, even though people often perceive them as socialists. They are not socialists. They have really low levels of regulation. It's easy to start a business. They have low barriers to international trade. They tend to have relatively large governments, but they make up for it in a lot of other ways.
Interesting. And you said U.S. came in #5, was it?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Any final thoughts on what Canadian governments need to do to improve our economic freedom?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, reducing the burden of government, cutting taxes, reducing spending, making it easier to start businesses, all of that is going to be really positive, really positive effect on economic freedom. All the governments in the world right now, we're coming out of this big inflationary period. Already we're starting to see reductions in the rate of inflation, and that is going to be an improvement in terms of economic freedom. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then maintaining some of the things that Canada does very, very well. Canada protects persons and property better than almost anybody else in the world. And so continuing to do that, of course, is going to be really, really important.
Great. Any other final thoughts there, Matthew?
So I guess what I would say is that, there's a lot of things that we can debate about what makes for a country more or less prosperous. And we should be looking at things like geography, and we should be looking at things like culture. And those do have an effect on human prosperity. But you can't really affect that stuff. You can't move mountains. You can't change the culture of a society overnight. But one thing you can do is affect policy. And we have all this accumulated evidence over the last 3 decades demonstrating that there's a positive correlation between economic freedom and prosperity. I think we need to open our eyes and to sort of recognize what works and what doesn't.
Okay, interesting. Thanks so much for being with us today, Matthew. Enjoyed having you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Matthew Mitchell is co-author of the study Economic Freedom of North America 2024, which you can read at FraserInstitute.org. The U.S. presidential election will be here very soon. And of course, here in Canada, we could see a federal election as well, because we currently have a minority government. Increasingly, we are hearing concerns about election integrity and potential election fraud. So joining me today from the Crow's Nest Pass area of Alberta is Fred Bradley. And many of you may remember Fred as the former MLA for Pincher Creek from 1975 through 1993. And he also served from 1995 to 2013 as a parliamentary development advisor in Ukraine, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan, which included advising on election integrity. So Fred, great to have you with us today. Welcome to Bridge City News.
Well, thank you very much. Very pleased to join you.
Okay, so Fred, what was your experience like in some of the foreign countries that we mentioned there? And to what degree did they experience attempts to manipulate the elections?
Well, my actual experience was in Ukraine in terms of election monitoring. And I monitored elections in 1998 parliamentary elections, the 2004 presidential election, and the 2012 parliamentary election. And over the period of time, I saw in my initial experience in 1998, there was certainly a lot of manipulation and fraud at the polling stations. But what I witnessed in 2004 during the presidential election was certainly very eye-opening, because I monitored the three rounds of the presidential election in 2004, and saw many different types of election fraud during that and manipulation of the vote. When we got to the 2012 parliamentary election, it was basically what we would call a fundamentally free and fair election. The processes, the results of the voting were accurate and portrayed the will of the people. But I saw some interesting things in 1998 in terms at polling stations. Obviously, manipulation by administrative resources being used to back the party of power's candidates in elections, voting irregularities at election polling stations. But 2004 was really the ultimate experience in monitoring pervasive election fraud conducted by the administration of the political party and the administration, presidential administration in Ukraine, or their cohorts, and Russian interference was obviously a hallmark of that. I could go into some detail on that if you wanted me to, but there was things like carousel voting, where buses would roll up and people would come out and go into polling stations and vote, and then go on to another polling station because their names were on multiple lists in multiple different polling stations, and that's how one way of influencing the vote. The other was disappearing ink, where if they knew a polling station was going to vote for an opposition candidate, they would have this disappearing ink pen, and when the ballots went to count, the ballots would not show the mark for the opposition candidate. And then there was actually in the second round experience, where the one constituency we were monitored in, that at the end of the day, the polling commission had got so expert in what they were doing, was they just reversed the results. So they reported that their favored candidate, which was the Russian-supported candidate, had won the election. They reversed the votes for the Yushchenko, who ultimately won the presidential election, but they just reversed the votes and filed them accordingly and said this was the result of the vote for this election commission in favor of the Yanukovych versus Yushchenko. So it was really a real eye opener in terms of what can be done. But the use of administrative resources, the election commissions itself, the Central Election Commission, they had 1 million more people vote at the end of the day that than had registered to vote during the election. So they just created all sorts of election. That was absolutely election fraud at a very high scale, which resulted in a third round of voting, the firing of the then Central Election Commission, which had perpetrated the fraud, and then had a fair and free election. The third round was absolutely different. They followed the procedures as laid out by the law, and they didn't have the interference that had taken place in the first election. That's basically the experience that I had witnessed in terms of election fraud.
So corrupt. Now, here in Canada and the US, there's been a lot of attention on foreign interference attempts from nations like China and Russia and Iran, among others. So what methods are hostile nations using to try to sway election results over here?
Well, there's all sorts of
it's gotten
and
more
I'm not
sophisticated, obviously, than the disappearing
yeah,
geek, right?
the game has changed incredibly. Social media is a big part of it.
Right.
Manipulating social media, fake news and propaganda, deep fakes and manipulated media. I mean, they hacking into political parties' campaigns. This is happening in the United States, both currently in terms of Democratic and Republican attacks. They can target voting infrastructure. There's just, there's diplomatic and economic pressures that have been used. They can targeting influence operations, manipulation of traditional media sources with putting in wrong data out there, which is then reported, et cetera. So there's many different ways in which foreign actors can interfere in our elections. And then then they have their espionage and covert operations, and they will also exploit any loopholes they see in our electoral processes if they can do that. So there are many different ways in which that foreign interference and manipulation can take place, and both Russia and China have been big actors in that in the United States. Russia more in the United States, China here in Canada, in terms of some of the recent things we've seen.
Do we know, Fred, if any of these efforts have actually changed the outcome of an election?
It's really that is really difficult to determine. I mean, in very close targeted ridings, it may have an influence. I mean, there's been those allegations in Canadian elections, particularly I think in one in Vancouver. They've manipulated political parties. Have they actually affected the results? That's extremely difficult to assess. In a very close election, I mean, how do you influence public opinion? If through social media and influencers, you influence public opinion, how do you measure that? How do you actually show that that's had an effect on the results? So that's one aspect. And recently, I think we've seen in the United States where the Russians have just perfected their manipulation, where they actually are paying domestic social media influencers to put forward their propaganda pieces, which they promoted in RT and other sources. So they're actually paying Americans or Canadians to manipulate what is being the information they want to target to voters in terms of trying to influence an election or public opinion. I mean, if you push certain stories which aren't true or there's partially true and just continue to push that with people generally, after many periods of receiving information, they start to, even though they may know something is false, it becomes part of the psyche of what they believe or what they think is true.
Yeah, that's true. What changes do you think the federal government could put in place to make it a lot more difficult for other nations to interfere?
Well, we currently have a Royal Commission that's looking into that, and we're going to provide some advice on that. Obviously, whether it's direct foreign influence by embassies or staff of embassies, I think actions need to be taken. I think the idea of having a foreign registry, I think other countries have it, Great Britain, the United States, Australia, to ensure that these activities, these agents have to register. And maybe, and our security services need to be perhaps given more resources to protect our electoral systems against this. Social media, how do you control that? We have the arguments of free speech versus actually putting out misinformation and misfacts. That's very difficult to control. And cybersecurity, I think you have to look at also those aspects. So there's many different ways we can look at it, but it's extremely difficult to in this age and with artificial intelligence and the manipulation that can be done there. I mean, we've seen in the United States where there's fake videos out there now.
That is the scariest thing, like you were saying before, the
of a very prominent musician endorsing one candidate when she's actually come out and endorsed another candidate publicly last night. So
yeah. Oh, that is the scariest. Do you think that we need stricter voter verification rules, or, as some argue, would that discourage people from voting? Because, you know, you hear stories of like election poll stations where, like, Elections Canada surveyed election officers during the 2019 Canadian federal election, discovered that, what was it, 35% of polling staff sometimes or often encountered individuals asking to vote who were not on the list of electors and who were unable to be registered at the polling station. So should that maybe raise some red flags?
Well, you know, I think we have some very good election processes in Canada. Okay. So what happens at polling stations, and maybe this, you know, we used to have an enumeration list where we hire enumerators to go door to door in the first part of when we had longer election periods. So we decided we had to shorten the election period. There used to be 2 months federal elections because it gave time for hiring enumerators to go door to door to register voters. Those lists would be published. Then people could go to the list and have an opportunity to revise and have their name put on the list. But we don't do that anymore. It's compiled electronically based on provincial records or federal records, and they have a list. That list, so we shortened the election campaign to basically a 1 month campaign. So if your name isn't on the list, you have an opportunity prior to the election to have your name added to the list. And you go, it's usually an electronic process. The day of the election, people will show up, and what we require for verification, even you'll get a polling card, I think, from the federal government. But what we require when you go to vote is to show a photo ID, a government-issued piece of photo ID with your name and address on it, or 2 pieces of ID showing your name and address. And that's when people go to the poll. They expect they can go in and vote. They may not have their ID with them that verifies that. So, and their name may not be on the list. And that's where, that's where the issue comes in. You go to the polling station and you haven't brought your ID with you. And people will say, I'm not on the list, or I can't vote because I don't have my ID. Yeah. So that's pretty strict. I mean, that's pretty strict identification of a voter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Photo ID or 2 pieces of government issued or something, a utility bill that has your name and address that proves that you are a resident in the place in which you were voting. That I think is the cause. But I do think, you know, those requirements are very very stringent to some degree. That you have to have these 2 pieces of ID to prove who you are. So it's very. I don't think you have people voting who aren't eligible to vote. It's people who may be disqualified because they can't prove their residency. Does that change the results of an election? I think those. And the other thing, if you don't have that information, if you have a voter, a friend, or someone goes with you who lives in you sign a sworn statement that I live in such and such a address, and you have a neighbor or a friend who comes and signs a sworn statement, yes, I know this person, I verify that they live at this address, they will put you on the list. So, I mean, that would be access to voting. Do all citizens have credible access to voting? And we have all sorts of procedures for absentee voting if you're out of the country, or if you are in a nursing home, or some incapacitated voting opportunities for people.
Right. Oh gosh, it looks like we're out of time here. But Fred, we appreciate you coming on today and sharing your knowledge with us, especially from the voting interference that you experienced in those other countries. So fascinating.
Well, it was certainly a fascinating experience for me, and a very interesting period of time in my life.
Absolutely. Fred Bradley is the former Alberta MLA and an overseas parliamentary development advisor. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.